As you're going to see in the following slides, Craig is an incredibly accomplished scholar. He has been at both the U.S. Naval Academy and the Naval War College. He is the author of 17 books and has won a raft of awards, and just recently also won the incredibly prestigious Pritzker Award from the Pritzker Military History Museum. This is a Lifetime Achievement Award acknowledging his body of work. This is kind of the equivalent of winning the military history Oscar. It's incredible. So that's wonderful. I want to talk, though, about a different aspect of Craig. Yes. Well done. One of the things that has consistently impressed me about the Pacific War naval history community as a whole is that it has just been incredibly collaborative and collegial in nature. In the 25 plus years that I have been working with this group of people, they consistently are willing to share their insights and their knowledge, pointing out sources to people that they might have overlooked, in many cases saying, oh, yeah, I've got that, let me email that to you. When I first started working in this field, I never thought that people like Craig or Richard Frank or John Lundstrom would, even deign to answer my emails, and yet, they ended up becoming my friends. Without Craig, I don't know that I would have had the opportunity for some of the joint speaking engagements that we've attended at places like Pearl Harbor and most recently down in Texas at the Nimitz Museum. Without Craig, I certainly wouldn't have had early access to the Sink Pack, the recipe for Admiral Nimitz's preferred homegrown cocktail that he served in Pearl Harbor and that I serve in my house pretty frequently. So that's just one of the benefits that I feel blessed in having as being a part of this wider community of which Craig is a prominent member. So please join me in welcoming to the stage not only an absolutely tremendous scholar in the field, but also a heck of a nice guy, my friend Craig Symonds.
Wow, what an introduction. How can I live up to that? That's really nice, John. Thank you. I also want to thank this organization, and particularly Don Patton, who's been so good to me, and who is responsible for so much wonderful stuff that happens around here. I picked up a copy of the tablette on my way in, which most of you probably did as well, and it's so thorough that I don't need to give my speech now. So just read this and you're good to go. I also want to thank Steve and Mark for driving me around, picking me up at the airport, and showing me the sights of Minneapolis. It's been a great day. It's been a great day, and I hope it continues to be. We'll see. Some of you know, and as was mentioned, that my most recent work is on Admiral Chester Nimitz. And when I first got a call to talk here, I thought that might be the subject, but, and I'm happy to answer any questions about Admiral Nimitz that any of you might have, but Don asked me to talk more broadly about the Naval War, about a big book that I wrote, the World War II at Sea, nearly 800 pages. It has to be a big book. It was a big war, as we all know. A war that involved more than 70 nations. For Americans, that war began on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day. For the British, the French, the Germans, and especially for the Polish, it began 2 years before that, on September 1st, 1939. And for the Japanese, and especially the Chinese, it began 2 years before that, on July 7th, 1937. So in considering the global aspect of this conflict, it's important to acknowledge, I believe, all of those participants, including those who fought in theaters that many Americans don't pay a lot of attention to, such as the Indian Ocean, the Barents Sea, and at least until 1942, the Mediterranean. For American audiences, the most famous book about this topic is this one. Samuel Eliot Morison, you may have heard of him, The Two-Ocean War. Morrison was a Harvard professor in 1941 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and he asked President Franklin Roosevelt for a Navy commission. Apparently you could do that in those days. Mr. President, I'm from Harvard, and I would like a commission. He wanted to go to sea and chronicle the war as an insider. Roosevelt made him a lieutenant commander, and Morrison went to sea. He was on board Navy ships at several historic events, including both the landings in North Africa and Operation Torch and the invasion of Okinawa in 1945. And he stayed with the Navy and the project and retired some years after the war as a rear admiral. So he was both Professor Morrison and Admiral Morrison. In addition to his own experiences, he had scores of other officers send him their reports, often first-hand accounts of aspects of the war that he did not witness personally. The result was a 15-volume history of the naval war, much of which he wrote himself and all of which he supervised as general editor. Now, apparently there were some readers who were slightly intimidated by sitting down at night to read a 15-volume work. No one here, of course, falls into that category. So he later wrote a 1-volume version, which is still in print. But note the title. Whoops, I got to back up here. Where are we going? Yeah. The Two-Ocean War. One that took place in the Atlantic, that featured particularly the war convoy defense against Hitler's U-boats, and another that took place in the Pacific, where combat was characterized by huge carrier battles as well as amphibious landings on islands from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. It is an excellent, quite readable account of the role of the U.S. Navy in two oceans. But remember, I said there were more than 70 nations, 72 nations, as a matter of fact, who took part in that war, voluntarily or involuntarily in a few cases, and nearly a dozen of those nations had substantial navies that played important roles. The U.S. Navy was the largest, or at least it became the largest by 1943, but it was not the only one. Then, too, the naval war was fought not in two oceans, but in at least 6, including the Arctic, as well as in several seas, including the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. It was, in short, a global war, quite literally a world war, more so than the First World War. In addition to the U.S. Navy and the British Royal Navy, we should not ignore the French, the Poles, the Russians, the Australians, the Canadians, the Dutch, and the Norwegians. Got to get that in here in Minnesota. Plus, of course, the Axis navies, the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, who had a substantial naval force. All those navies played roles. Obviously, some more prominent than others in defining the trajectory, and I argue even the outcome, of the Second World War. So that's my first point. It truly was a global war. Now, the second point I want to make involves resources, and especially shipping. When national leaders sought to construct a global strategy for this war, they not only had to take the entire globe into consideration, they had to make hard decisions about where and how to allocate the scarce resources, because committing resources to one theater, one of these orange circles, necessarily meant not committing it to another. There is something called, you ready for this slide, the butterfly effect, where supposedly a butterfly flapping its wings in Indonesia can create a typhoon in someplace else. Now, I'm skeptical of the literal truth of that story, but it's a useful metaphor to keep in mind, and that is that they were all interconnected. The global character of the naval war was especially evident in 1942, the first full year of American involvement in the Second World War, when the demands for Allied resources were ubiquitous. What was the movie that won the award? everywhere all the time, whatever it was the other night, that pretty much describes the war. In the Atlantic, to fight off the U-boats. In the Pacific, to slow down, at least, to the Japanese. In the Arctic, to take supplies to the Red Army, which, after all, was bearing the brunt of the land war against the Wehrmacht. In the Mediterranean, where the British were desperately trying to keep open the supply line between Gibraltar and Suez. Even in the Indian Ocean, where a Japanese carrier force, the same one that had struck at Pearl Harbor, attacked both Ceylon and British bases on the mainland of India. All those flapping butterfly wings meant that the strategic decision makers could not pursue a single line of approach. They had to parcel out their scarce assets here and there, hoping the world did not collapse on them entirely. So the second thing to remember in thinking generally about the war at sea is that it was not one of armies and navies fighting. It was a war of production. It was a war of allocation. It was a war of distribution. In short, it was a war decided, as so many wars are, by logistics. Early on, the Allies did try to address these various conflicts one at a time. The American chief of operations was Harold Stark, universally known as Betty. We can address the reasons why he was known as Betty in the Q&A if you're interested in such a thing. He came by it at the Naval Academy, where traditionally the upper class imposes a nickname on the plebes when they arrive. In those days, it was virtually common, less so now. I don't know what your nickname was down at the academy. No, you're shaking his head at me, so I won't pursue that. But note, here's a letter from the chairman of the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, to the Chief of Naval Operations, Harold Stark, and note the salutation, if you can read it. Dear Betty. So Stark became Chief of Naval Operations on August 1st, 1939. August 1st, 1939, exactly 1 month before Germany invaded Poland to begin the Second World War. His principal contribution to Allied strategy was a memo that he wrote in 1940 after France had capitulated and the British were driven from the beaches at Dunkirk. At that point, it looked very much like the Germans were going to win the war in Europe. You'd have gotten very good odds that Britain was not going to survive. And given that, Stark laid out 4 options in this new environment for the United States to consider. First, we could simply stay on the defensive and defend the Western Hemisphere. Tuck in, defend. Second, the United States could focus all its efforts on a possible war with Japan. That, after all, had been the primary consideration of naval planners since at least 1911 for the Pacific Ocean. Third, we could try to fight in both oceans at the same time, which seemed problematical. Or fourth, we could reverse 20 years of strategic planning and reorient our entire strategy toward the defeat of Germany. That fourth option, Plan D, Plan Dog in Navy lingo, was the option he recommended and the one that was accepted by Franklin Roosevelt. The shorthand for this policy is, as everyone here I'm sure knows, is simply Germany first. Roosevelt believed that Germany, Nazi Germany, was far more dangerous to world stability, not only because of its perverse ideology and obvious aggressive intent, but also because of its economy. Germany's gross domestic product in 1940 was larger than those of Britain and France combined, and 6 times that of Japan. In Roosevelt's mind, it was essential to defeat Germany first, and in particular, to keep Britain from going down to defeat. After all, if Britain fell, there would be no staging platform for any future invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, should it come to that. That was the justification for the whole Lend-Lease program. We need to keep Britain in this war to have a launching platform also to save Britain, by the way. Most historians and nearly all textbooks, whether they're going to delete World War II from high school curriculum, it's just incomprehensible to me. But those textbooks tend to treat the Germany First principle as if it were a literal truth. There might be a chapter on the war in Europe, and then a second chapter on the war in the Pacific as if they happened sequentially. But of course, that is not the way it was fought. When American and British admirals met, as they did regularly, to discuss Allied strategy, they all paid lip service to the idea of defeating Germany first, but the pressures were immediate. They were everywhere. They were simultaneous and ubiquitous. Remember the butterfly. The Anglo-Americans in 1942 were like the boy in front of a dam leaking in 12 places at once and trying to plug the holes. Every theater commander wanted more of everything, and the one thing that they specifically needed more of was shipping. So here's the third thing. In addition to being a global war fought by a dozen navies in 6 oceans, and a war that was driven by the production of the tools of war, it was a war in which there was never quite enough shipping. A few examples. In August 1942, you were talking earlier at the pre-meeting, a single reinforced U.S. Marine Division splashed ashore on Guadalcanal Island. The one where the blue arrow there, the bottom of the Solomon Island chain. Most Americans had never heard of it, couldn't find it on a map at the time. Now this in itself is a violation of the Germany First principle. This is the first Allied offensive of the war, and it's in Guadalcanal. But Admiral Ernest King, the American Chief of Naval Operations, argued that this was not really an offensive, you see. It was merely to keep the Japanese from further expanding their Pacific empire. They were trying to build an airfield there. So in his view, it was a defensive move. Okay. King, by the way, as most everybody here probably knows, was a notoriously gruff individual. He knew exactly how he wanted the war to be fought, and he was a powerful voice for assuming the offensive as soon as possible in the Pacific to keep the Japanese back on their heels, not to allow them to consolidate their defensive perimeter, which would increase the cost of taking it back later. He knew full well that putting a single Marine division ashore on Guadalcanal would be the camel's nose under the tent, because he knew that once U.S. forces were committed in the Solomon Islands, that they would have to be supported. They would draw more resources and reinforcement, like a black hole, into the fighting front, and that is exactly what happened. There was another complication, and that was what to do with this guy. MacArthur was such a senior general, and very popular with the civilians back home who read about him in the paper all the time, thanks to MacArthur's staff, who put out daily communiques. And that's especially following his "I shall return" announcement in Australia, that Roosevelt knew he had to give MacArthur an important command. Alas, MacArthur also had a lot of personal and political baggage. He was imperious, he was disdainful of others, the focus of much attention by others as a possible future presidential candidate. Roosevelt did not want to give him command of the entire Pacific, nor did he want to give him control of the U.S. Navy, something that would have made Ernie King's head explode. So, like King Solomon, he cut the baby in half. MacArthur got command of what was called the Southwest Pacific, or Southwest Pac, in the inevitable acronym. It was a fairly large command that, as you can see, included the continent of Australia, the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, including the Big Islands of New Guinea, Borneo, and Sumatra, the British colony of Malaya, Singapore, and, of course, the Philippines, which, as far as MacArthur was concerned, was the object of the entire Pacific campaign. The rest of the Pacific, embracing an area 5 times larger than MacArthur's, though of course mostly water, was called the Pacific Ocean Area, and it was put under the command of Navy Admiral Chester Nimitz. And of course I have to put this slide on the screen. I love this picture of him, by the way. He looks looking at that cameraman like, who let that cameraman on board this ship? So I'm not exactly objective in discussing the relationship between Nimitz and MacArthur. This slide, for example, which I think is a staged photograph, obviously, but the caption, I believe, should say, "Look, Doug, Japan is over here." In effect, the United States, with British compliance, decided to make the Pacific two separate command theaters, and that meant divided command. MacArthur did not believe in a divided command, both on philosophical grounds and, quite frankly, because he thought he should command all of it. He complained about this regularly, constantly, directly, to his own boss in the Joint Chiefs, George Marshall, and to the President himself. Secretly, MacArthur believed that Roosevelt had trimmed down the size of his command on purpose, limiting it so that MacArthur couldn't win the war, come back as a hero, and challenge him in the 1944 presidential campaign. A scenario that MacArthur seems at least to have thought about. But the decision stood, and so when the U.S. Marines splashed ashore on Guadalcanal in August of 1942 to begin a campaign in the tropical jungle that would last for most of 6 months, the United States was now in effect fighting not only a two-ocean war, as Morrison called it, but by dividing its forces between MacArthur and Nimitz in the Pacific, and invading North Africa as well, it was actually engaged now in a 4-front war. Remember, I said earlier that shipping was a key to trying to maintain these simultaneous offensives. This was especially evident during the campaign for Guadalcanal. Though the official name of the campaign was Operation Watchtower, resources were so scarce in 1942 that the popular name ascribed to it was Operation Shoestring. We went there early, we went there with inadequate resources, and we had a hell of a time sustaining those hard-pressed Marines on the island. Marines managed to hang on to that foothold, but only just. And the United States had to devote almost literally all the shipping it had in the Pacific Ocean to keep them there. But, and here's where the global aspect of the naval war became evident, at the same time the Marines were fighting to hang on to their little enclave on Guadalcanal, the Anglo-American allies also conducted an invasion of French North Africa. Having decided on a Germany-first strategy, Roosevelt and Churchill were eager to get Allied forces into combat somewhere in Europe, and since Europe itself looked like too tough a nut to crack, this is what was possible. It's a bit problematic in that there were no Germans in North Africa. That's embarrassing. But once U.S. and British troops landed there, the Germans arrived soon enough, as you can see with the blue arrows there coming from Sicily into North Africa. And as on Guadalcanal, sustaining and even expanding the Allied foothold in North Africa proved stressful. This is how the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters were really won. There was a worldwide shortage of shipping and multiple competing demands for it. Ships were needed for the North Atlantic convoys to Britain that kept British citizens fed and supplied. Ships were needed for convoys to Russia, who rounded the North Cape to keep the Red Army bearing the brunt of the war against Germany. And more ships were required for the 2 campaigns in the Pacific. Everybody wanted more shipping. Now, with those butterfly wings flapping in the Pacific and the Atlantic, let me take a few minutes to talk about the Mediterranean. Almost exactly in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea is the tiny island of Malta. It's actually two islands, the main island of Malta and the even tinier island of Gozo. Tiny as they were also crucial to British interests in the Mediterranean. Malta sat almost exactly at the nexus of the line between Gibraltar and Suez for the Allies and between Italy and North Africa for the Axis. Its airfield provided cover for British convoys and was a threat to Axis convoys because its ancient harbor at Valletta sat quite literally on the flank of Axis sea lanes. So, naturally, the Germans and Italians wanted to eliminate this thorn in their side. They considered seizing it by a paratroop invasion. But a similar operation in Crete had not turned out well for the Germans, and the Luftwaffe said it could do the job unaided. I've heard this from Air Forces my whole life. So throughout the spring and summer of 1942, German aircraft pounded Malta. Here's a statistic. More bombs were dropped on the tiny island of Malta in the single month of April 1942 than were dropped on London in the whole of the Blitz. And they had an impact. By July 1942, the island was in extremis. The food ration was down to 6 ounces of food per person per week. The Spitfires were nearly out of fuel. If they could not fly, the island would be defenseless. The island's governor informed London that unless a convoy got through in the next week, the island must fall. So the British scraped together what transport shipping they had, cobbled together a convoy in Glasgow, Scotland. It consisted of 14 transports, including the oil tanker Ohio, which was transferred from the U.S. flag to British service for this convoy. An argument can be made, in fact, I guess I'm making it right now, that in August of 1942, the Ohio was the single most crucial vessel on the planet. If she and her cargo of aviation fuel did not make it to Malta, the Spitfires would be grounded, the island would fall, the Axis would control the Mediterranean. Dubbed Operation Pedestal, the convoy set out in the first week of August. Now, here's why I'm telling you this story. Note the date. It's the same week the Marines went ashore on Guadalcanal. Here's an unmistakable manifestation of the global war being fought quite literally on the same day on opposite sides of the world. The Pedestal convoy, by the way, had the strongest escort of any convoy in history. These 14 ships were escorted by 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers, all to guard 14 transports, but especially that oil tanker. It was a bigger escort force than either of the Japanese or American fleets that had fought at the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. Most Americans never heard of it. It was a measure not only of the importance attached to the survival of Malta, but to the scarcity and value of that transport shipping. In the perilous trek from Gibraltar to Malta, the Pedestal convoy lost 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, several destroyers, and 9 of the 14 transports, and of course thousands of sailors' lives. It was, in short, a massacre, far worse than Allied losses off Guadalcanal that same week in the Battle of Savo Island. The Germans focused on the tanker, and rather amazingly, we actually have a photo of the moment she was hit by an aerial torpedo. But in spite of that, she somehow remained afloat. And 5 days later, with her decks awash, her back broken, no engine, no steering, no compass, and with pieces of a German bomber actually hung up in her superstructure, she was tugged, pushed, even carried into Valletta Harbor, where cheering crowds lined the waterfront and a band played Rule Britannia. Malta remained in British hands for the rest of the war. Now, my point in telling you this story is not just that it's a pretty amazing story, one that a lot of students of the Second World War overlook, but also to illustrate that the naval war did not proceed, as some books suggest, first in Europe and then in the Pacific, but everywhere at the same time. And it illustrates how precarious was the state of Allied shipping in the late summer of 1942. The 18 transports at Guadalcanal and the 14 transports involved in Pedestal, 9 of which were sunk, formed a pool of sea transports so limited that it restricted what the Allies could do strategically. This particular problem would never entirely disappear, but it would dramatically diminish over time because of American shipbuilding capability. And here's my final point about the naval war. What finally defeated the Axis in World War II was not just grit, bravery, sacrifice. It needed all of that. But even with that, it would have been difficult without American industrial productivity. This is most evident, of course, in the Battle of the Atlantic between German U-boats and Allied convoys. Even as the predations of the U-boats increased throughout 1942, the number of ships built by the United States increased too. By 1943, not only were there more escorts and more efficient anti-submarine weapons available to Allied convoys, but in a brutal and utterly critical assessment of the Battle of the Atlantic, the key was that by the end of 1942, the United States could build ships faster than the Germans could sink them. Here in this slide, you can see that from 1939 to 42, the number of Allied ships sunk by U-boats, represented by the black bars, was pretty frightening. Then in December of 42, the production of new ships, the red bars, surpassed 1 million tons a month for the first time and went up from there. The number of sinkings also dropped off due to the increased escorts, new and better equipment. It's a pretty gruesome calculus, but from 1943 on, it didn't matter how many ships the U-boats could sink. They would never get ahead of American shipbuilding. By 1943, the Germans had lost the Battle of the Atlantic, and they knew it. Here's a kind of a vivid example of how this new construction changed the war. Here is a photograph of a group working in a shipyard to lay the keel of a Liberty ship in 1943. So we'll call this day one. By the way, don't tell OSHA about the headgear on the shipyard workers here. I'm not sure it was up to reg. All right, here's day one. Here's the same ship, this ship, 1 day later. 1 day. Here it is on day 6, day 10, day 14, day 24, and there it goes. 1 month. 1 month. And there are hundreds of these shipyards around the periphery of the United States. This rather astonishing success of the American shipbuilding program meant that the convoys got through, the troop ships got through, the buildup for D-Day could begin. Speaking of D-Day, let me offer one more example of how the war was global in character. In June of 1944, famously, the Allies, Americans, British, Canadians, and French, invaded Nazi-occupied Europe at Normandy. It is the single most famous campaign of the entire war. Most students of the war are aware of what a massive undertaking it was, how many thousands of ships were necessary to execute it. Some stories of D-Day focus on what happened when the first landing craft hit the beach. At least as important is what happened before that. The essential building of the transports, the landing craft, especially the ships known as landing ships tank, LSTs, which you can see here on Omaha Beach. These specially designed ships, like this one, did not even exist before 1942, but they were essential to carry tanks and trucks to the invasion beach. Despite the astonishing output of American industry that I just mentioned, there were never quite enough LSTs to go around. Commanders wanted them in the Mediterranean to land on Sicily and Italy. Other commanders wanted them in the Pacific for Tarawa and Kwajalein. And of course, Eisenhower wanted them for the invasion of Normandy. The need was so universal, even U.S. shipyards could not keep up with the demand. So D-Day was postponed for a month, originally scheduled for May 1st, 1944, to June, in order to allow for the construction of 56 more LSTs. And yet, even as Allied troops fought for the Normandy beaches, a lesser-known second D-Day took place that same month, only a week and a half apart, half a world away, in the Marianas, on Saipan. Indeed, the naval armada for the invasion of Saipan was more powerful than the one at Normandy. The Normandy armada was numerically larger, but it had fewer warships, and of course no aircraft carriers, whereas the Allied invasion force for Saipan included 15 aircraft carriers, more than 1,000 airplanes, and 84 of those precious and scarce LSTs, even though Eisenhower was begging for just one or two more. Here then is another example of a truly global war. The fact that the Anglo-Americans could mount two enormous invasion armadas on opposite sides of the world at the same time shows first how the American industrial dynamo had changed the calculus of battle from 1942, when a shortage of transports threatened disaster at both Guadalcanal and Malta, to 1944, when the Allies could assemble two enormous invasion fleets, each consisting of thousands of ships. It also demonstrates how the naval war was global, simultaneous, and interconnected. Germany first was the official Allied strategy, and yet, by 1944, the Allies had become so dominant at sea that they could fight in the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Mediterranean and the Arctic all at the same time. All wars, including World War II, are eventually won on the ground. It's important, even for a naval historian, to acknowledge the horrific sacrifices made by Russian soldiers on the Eastern Front, by Chinese soldiers in Asia, that ground down the Axis powers over a period of years while enduring horrendous losses. And yet it is also important to remember just how much the course of the war was charted and steered, did you see the thing I did there? By maritime events. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Simons wanted to give you all an exam. I pointed out that none of us are midshipmen anymore. Anyways, fabulous. Can you believe we can get this right here in Minnesota? So thank you for coming out, Dr. Simons. You know, we are having trouble getting Navy veterans, and so in lieu of having one of those esteemed defenders of liberty, Andrew's going to talk about a Navy veteran from Minnesota we can all be proud of. His name is Captain Richard Fleming. My son Andrew, why don't you come up, Andrew? He is a 2019 graduate of St. John's University and a very deep historical researcher and presenter here at the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. And Andrew, it's your floor.
I've been asked to speak tonight on the veteran connection that ties into Dr. Craig Simons' presentation regarding his excellent book, World War II at Sea. In the absence of a World War II veteran in the flesh tonight, the roundtablers and myself decided to shed light on a local hero, United States Marine Corps Captain Richard E. Fleming, who won the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions at the Battle of Midway. Fleming Field in South St. Paul is named after him, which many of you may have made that connection already. Captain Fleming sacrificed his life defending a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and lived his life in the most purposeful and honorable way. I have titled my presentation for tonight, Overture of Sacrifice, and we'll see why later. Before I get started, there are a few organizations and individuals I need to thank who made my research tonight in the slideshow possible. I'd like to thank St. Thomas Academy, from which Captain Fleming is an alumni, the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, Fort Snelling National Cemetery, Dr. Craig Simons, retired Army Colonel Don Patton, retired Navy Captain Brooks Berg, and my colleague, Mr. Steve Dobbins-Beck. Each one of these programs that you see tonight is a team effort and nothing if not a collaboration between a lot of selfless people. All right, so here we are. Richard Eugene Fleming. He was born in 1917 in St. Paul. He was raised in St. Paul as well before the existence of Interstate 94 and the freeway system. Back then, St. Paul was a smaller city home to lots of German, Irish, and Polish immigrants and was a regional hub for riverine commerce and rail lines. Richard attended the St. Thomas Military Academy, where he graduated in 1935 as the cadet commander, the top student cadet in his class. We will notice that Richard had a habit for distinguishing himself. He was a very gifted and intelligent individual with a knack for peer leadership and technical proficiency. Richard earned his Bachelor in Arts degree from the University of Minnesota in 1939, where he was a member of the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity. Delta Kappa Epsilon is still a functioning fraternity headquartered on University Avenue Southeast. I wonder if any of their current members are aware of the pedigree they're responsible for continuing. Those are some big shoes to fill. Now, for the rest of the slideshow, we will see that the United States Marine Corps and Richard Fleming's life will intersect for the remainder of his time on this earth. Richard's life as a civilian was not long for this world, and he was called to a higher purpose as soon as he graduated from college. I'm sure that he, like many young men at the time, knew there was trouble brewing in the world, and he must have known that he wanted to be ready in case the imminent conflict reached the United States. Fascinated with flight, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps Reserve in 1939, shortly after earning his bachelor's degree. Lieutenant Fleming completed his flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where he graduated again at the top of his class. By now it's 1940, and Germany has invaded Poland. The Nazi Jagdboot covers Europe, and France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Low Countries are all under Hitler's control. The United States is increasing its sanctions and embargoes on Japan, particularly concerning the emperor's oil supply, and tensions are rising. Lieutenant Fleming's first duty station was in San Diego, where he arrived a month before the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. He was ultimately destined for Midway Atoll, however, and he arrived there with his unit 10 days after the surprise attack that left the United States Pacific Surface Fleet in shambles. Fleming was a flight officer in Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241. Over the next 6 months, Fleming acquires the lay of the land, or should I say sea, around Midway, flying patrols, analyzing the weather patterns, making landings at day and night on the airstrips on the isolated atoll. He was promoted to first lieutenant in April 1942 and then to captain a short month later in May, no doubt due to his leadership prowess and aircraft navigation skills. Captain Fleming was known by this time for his expert handling of his aircraft and his ability to lead doctrinally and technically sound attacks. A little known fact of these Marine Scout bomber squadrons is at this point in the war they did not fly all the ubiquitous SPD Dauntless, which is without a doubt one of the, if not the, most easily recognizable planes associated with the victory in the Pacific. No, you have to remember this is United States Marine Corps, which throughout history always does more with less, and often operates the rest of the War Department's leftover and obsolete weapons and materiel. Let's not forget that after Midway, in the late summer of 1942, just 2 short months after, the Marines on Guadalcanal initially assaulted the island with bolt-action Springfield rifles and water-cooled 30 cal heavy machine guns, while the Army at the same time was prepping for land battle in North Africa a few months later with semi-automatic M1 Garands and lighter air-cooled 30 cal machine guns. Captain Fleming's craft was the Vought SB-2U Vindicator. As the Japanese fleet, known as the Kido Butai, approached in May 1942, his aircraft had already been obsolete for a couple of years. This was a modest Depression-era airframe that was rolled off the production line as low-wing monoplane strike aircraft were newly replacing biplanes, such as the Curtiss BFC-2. The total number of Vindicators produced, 260, is indicative that this was a pre-war design through and through. Also similar produced in modest isolationist era numbers was another obsolete airframe that saw combat at Midway, the TBD Devastator. Vindicators were not mass produced throughout the war because they were later replaced by more capable aircraft like the SBD, SB-2C Helldiver, and the Avenger. Its far underpowered engine produced well below 1,000 horsepower, and its combat cruise speed only gave it 120 to 130 mile an hour advantage over the ships it was chasing. While performing a dive bomb or a glide bombing attack, it could carry one bomb under the center line that was released from a carriage that gave it clearance from its two-bladed propeller. And that's significant because by the end of the war, everything has 4 blades. The Vindicator was also lightly armed with one 50 cal machine gun in the starboard wing and one flex-mounted 50 cal in the rear gunner's seat. Behind me, you can see a photo of a destroyed Vindicator that was a casualty of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And below that photo, you'll see a rare photograph of one of Fleming's squadron mates taking off from Midway Island. Vindicator pilots and crew begrudgingly called their planes wind indicators, which should say enough about their slow speed and seeming ability to be blown around by a headwind. Now, let's talk about Midway Atoll. Why was the most fearsome Japanese carrier strike force ever assembled headed for this isolated, seemingly small base? Midway Atoll consists of 2 islands, Sand and Eastern Island, and a lagoon. The small size of the base on Midway is disproportionate to the role it would play in changing the course of history. As part of Roosevelt's Pacific Ocean defense initiatives in the late 1930s, the base and naval air station were completed and operational in 1940. It was home to a surprisingly large number of aircraft by the time of the battle: 31 PBY Catalina long-range oceanic patrol aircraft, 17 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers, and 4 B-26 Marauder medium bombers, in addition to dozens of fighter aircraft and strike aircraft like those piloted by Captain Fleming's VMSB-241. That's the name of his unit. If you were to replace these aircraft with Japanese aircraft, you can quickly understand that what a detriment to the Pacific Ocean security the loss of Midway Atoll would be. Not to mention, Midway is the second to last island system in the greater Hawaiian island chain. So the political connection of Midway to the United States is much like that of Iwo Jima to the Empire of Japan. This was and still is American soil. Assuming the Japanese took Midway Atoll and were somehow able to effectively supply their own naval air station there, the U.S. Navy would be in an extremely threatened position very close to its own home turf. Besides the base itself, the Imperial Japanese Navy was looking to challenge the U.S. carrier fleet to a once-and-for-all showdown on the high seas, winner take all. They were confident that they could use the invasion of Midway as a medium for this head-to-head carrier clash to inflict a decisive defeat on the U.S. Navy and push Washington further towards suing for peace. A little-known fact about Midway is that it was actually simultaneously attacked by 2 Japanese destroyers on December 7th, 1941, as the attack on Pearl Harbor was underway. This was part of the larger coordinated strike on U.S. naval installations all over the Pacific, like Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. The destroyers were repulsed, and this stands as the first American victory of the war. Today, Midway's active 8,000-foot runway serves as an extended twin-engine operations, or ETOPS runway, for passing twin-engine passenger aircraft. Behind me, you will see the bases at Midway Atoll as Captain Fleming would have seen them in November 1941 looking east. It may not appear to be much, but these 2 little islands in this lagoon changed the course of history. In 7 months from the time this photo was taken, this would be the scene of a battle after which the Japanese would never return to the offensive in practice. The battle commenced on June 4th, 1942. U.S. Navy code breakers had long since broken the Japanese naval code and knew that the Kido Butai were steaming for Midway. Many of the people in this auditorium know the story of the Japanese destroyer Arashio and its fateful chase of the USS Nautilus, which ultimately gave the location of the Kido Butai away from the fuel-starved U.S. Navy strike planes led by Wade McCluskey. What is lesser known, however, is the Marine Corps' contribution to the battle on June 4th. Planes from VMSB 241 took off from Midway amid the chaos to look for Japanese carriers as well, and successfully found them. Captain Fleming's squadron commander, Major Lofton Henderson, was shot down during the Marine scout bomber's first strike on the Japanese carriers. Henderson would later be the namesake of the legendary airfield at Guadalcanal. This put Captain Fleming in charge of the squadron at only 24 years old, 2 years younger than myself, I should add. Few words can describe the weight on Captain Fleming's shoulders as he was charged with leading a group of obsolete 1930s strike planes against the baddest and saltiest pilots and sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Also not a small task was being responsible for shooting the combat air patrol off of Fleming's back, a job that fell on Rear Gunner Private First Class George A. Toms. Without fear, Fleming and Toms led the 2nd Division of VMSB 241 on a dive bombing attack of the Mikuma, a massive Japanese heavy cruiser. These slow, underpowered aircraft stood little chance of success in the face of the complement of weaponry the heavy cruiser could fill the air with, along with its escorts. As a result of withering anti-aircraft fire, Fleming's men were unable to press home their attacks, and a few aircraft were lost on their approach to attack the Mikuma. Dauntless in the face of almost certain death, Captain Fleming pitched his lone Vindicator into a 70-degree dive, stressing the SB-2U's airframe to its limit. The urgency of this task must have been sitting deep in his stomach because Captain Fleming reportedly dove to an absurd 400 feet before releasing his bomb. At that low of an altitude, he must have likely missed the wave tops by mere yards as he pulled out of his dive. The forces on Fleming and Tom's bodies, let alone their aircraft, are sobering to even imagine. Captain Fleming's bomb hit its target, but it's unclear in historical materials what the effect of this bomb hit was. It wasn't until Captain Fleming rejoined his formation and landed safely back on Midway that he noticed his wind indicator had been perforated by 179 anti-aircraft round hits. He himself was wounded in 2 places as well and received medical attention that night. The next day on June 5th, Captain Richard Fleming awoke after only 4 hours of sleep, likely still in pain from his wounds, and was given another mission. This time, VMSB 241 was to go back out to the Mikuma and endeavor to sink it. It's not known whether Fleming and Toms took off that day in a fresh Vindicator or their one that was shot to hell the day before, but regardless, the 2 men took off to the skies for the final time in the lead of the squadron. Fleming's plan was a coordinated glide and dive bombing attack that would hopefully split up the target package's anti-aircraft defenses and ensure a higher chance of bomb hits. While on approach as part of the glide bombing element, Fleming's SB-2U was fatally struck by likely a 25mm anti-aircraft round from the heavy cruiser and caught fire. But, always leading by example and not one to leave his mission incomplete, Captain Fleming continued on. He must have known he was about to die. With his last actions on this earth, he released his bomb at, again, an absurd 500 feet above the Mikuma, landing a very near miss, and then crashed into the sea. Behind me, you'll see an artist's watercolor rendering of Fleming's last actions with his Vindicator on fire and going down above the Mikuma. Richard Fleming led by example from the time he was a young adult until he took his last breath at the controls of his doomed aircraft. His willingness to attack the enemy even while facing long odds beckons for the excellence that followed him from St. Thomas Military Academy in St. Paul, Minnesota, to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The Battle of Midway decimated Fleming's squadron. Of 30 aircraft, 23 were lost. 36 airmen were casualties. These men that went down joined their brothers of the Navy torpedo squadrons, who were the only elements of the U.S. strike squadrons to suffer more losses. Fleming's surviving squadron mates never forgot his final actions and recounted them in detail when they landed back on Midway. Through the military channels, Fleming was considered for and then awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His mother received the medal in his place on November 4th, 1942, just 2 days after what would have been his 25th birthday. Fleming's backseater, Private First Class George A. Toms, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross posthumously as well. As one of the greatest battles in U.S. military history, the Battle of Midway was no exception in its volume of sacrifice and proportionate number of medals and awards, many of which sadly were handed out posthumously. As for the Makuma, the heavy cruiser was finished off by U.S. Navy strike planes on June 6, 1942, resulting in a catastrophic loss of life aboard. Captain Fleming's Medal of Honor was mired by controversy in the decades to come. As historical accounts of the Battle of Midway surfaced in later years, notional and verbal histories unchecked became the accepted truth, even when they contradicted the official accounts. Even Fleming's medal citation itself had a slight error in it. The Makuma was labeled as a battleship, not a heavy cruiser. I don't blame the War Department, however. If I was staring into the belly of that beast from a slow-moving biplane upgrade, I'm sure I would have thought any huge ship I was up against was a battleship as well. The famous Japanese pilot Mitsuo Fuchida told the story differently as well. In his official statement, he describes Captain Fleming's action as bombing the Makuma the second time, hitting it, and then crashing his Vindicator into the ship itself. And I want to go off script here. Dr. Simons mentioned this might have been because he went so low. He must have thought this Marine Corps pilot was nuts and went straight into the ship. The citation in Fleming's Medal of Honor clearly and correctly states that he missed the ship and hit the ocean, and Fuchida was actually hundreds of miles away when it happened, as he was a pilot and part of the Kido Butai. It's not clear why Fuchida's account of the battle was accepted as gospel after the war, but next I'll show you a photograph of the Makuma before it sank. This photo has become wildly famous since the war and provides excellent insight into the moments before she went under. As you can see, the number 4 turret at the stern of the ship appears to have aircraft wreckage on it. It's because of this photo, in coincidence with Mitsuo Fuchida's account of the battle, that the collision rumor was allowed to propagate through popular history in the decades after the war. However, what you can see on the turret is not actually aircraft wreckage from Captain Fleming's plane. It's actually debris left behind from a catastrophic explosion suffered by the cruiser's Type 93 torpedo mounts. These chunks of ship deposited on the turret were blown into the air and landed there after the explosion, not left behind by a Marine pilot with a death wish. And I want to point out, can everyone see my laser pointer? These objects coming out of the ship are torpedoes that were blown out of their tubes. Richard Fleming's legacy: it is because of Americans like him that we won the war. He didn't do it alone, but he is an excellent and local example. Ordinary, talented, intelligent, smart men and women who answered the call to defend freedom and liberate oppressed territories far from their homes. He is one of the early cases we can look to and see bravery and duty exemplified to the highest degree. Tragically, the Allied victory in 1945 had the motif of extreme sacrifice displayed throughout the entire conflict, like a severed vein. Richard Fleming's contribution to the victory over evil in the Pacific reverberated throughout the war in many, many, many other examples we can look to for inspiration. And behind me I have lots of depictions of them. In the paratroopers in Normandy, led by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, who led a bloody bayonet charge across Purple Heart Lane to rout the defending Germans. The Marines landing at Tarawa, who suffered insane casualties to learn tough lessons about island-hopping warfare. The men of the 8th Air Force, who in total lost more men in the skies over Europe than all of the Marine Corps during World War II in their campaign to crush the Nazi war effort and the Luftwaffe before invading. And finally, in the same theater as Fleming, the TBD Devastator pilots, who themselves were devastated, but drew the Japanese combat air patrol to low level and unintentionally let the SBD's high-angle approach to the Kido Butai go more or less unguarded. Captain Fleming had a destroyer named after him, the USS Fleming DE-32, during the war, which served with distinction in the Pacific. Today, his legacy lives on near the place he grew up at Fleming Field in South St. Paul. Fleming's love of aviation is preserved with his namesake, where engines are heard today. His gravesite in Fort Snelling National Cemetery can be seen by the public today as well. I want to reiterate that men like Richard E. Fleming are the reason we are free today. Men like this only truly die when they stop being talked about, and that is when history is in jeopardy of repeating itself. We cannot minimize the sacrifice undertaken by these men in the name of life, liberty, and the pursuit of all who threaten it. Many of the men lost in the Battle of Midway would be the youngest men in the room here. And yet, the freedom of the world was decided by the actions of men like them in the right moments. Much like the overture of a symphony, Captain Fleming's sacrifice set the tone for the rest of the war. After the Battle of Midway, the Japanese were on the defensive until the atomic bombs were dropped and the U.S. accepted Japan's unconditional surrender. Actions of men like Fleming at Midway made this outcome happen, and never again was the U.S. on its back foot in the Pacific. That is why I titled this presentation Overture of Sacrifice. Thank you.
In the spirit of the Two-Ocean War, I'd like to also present Mike Gardia. Mike Gardia is an internationally recognized author and military historian, a veteran of the United States Army as an armor officer. He's twice been nominated for the Army Historical Foundation's Distinguished Book Award. As a speaker, he hosts a lecture series, Hal Moore, Lessons in Leadership, which is available for presentation worldwide. Mike Gardia has given presentations at the U.S. Special Operations Command, the International Spy Museum, and his work has been reviewed in the Washington Times, the Military Review, and many other publications. Mike holds a BA and MA in American History from the University of Houston, and he will talk to us today about a hero from the Atlantic side of the Two-Ocean War. Mike Gardia.
This is a very special gentleman that I would like to discuss with you all tonight. Probably someone who is an unsung hero, and also somebody whose legacy is actually all over the Twin Cities today. So the gentleman that I'd like to speak to you about, his name is Marty Romano. He was a crewman aboard PT-306. And I had the very special opportunity to interview Marty at length. He was one of several World War II veterans that I had the opportunity to interview as part of my book, The Combat Diaries. And I have to give a special thanks to Don Patton for arranging that interview. I remember it was about 2 years ago, as I was getting all my work ready for The Combat Diaries, I got a call from Don, and he said, "Mike, there's a guy that I really want you to meet. His name is Marty Romano." And the first thing that flashed through my mind is, wow, with a name like that, you got to be a tough guy, Marty Romano. And he said, you know, he said, this guy Marty, he's originally from New Jersey. He's lived in the Twin Cities for the past several years, and he was a crewman aboard PT-306 in the Mediterranean theater of operations. And the second thing that went through my mind at that point was, wow, I had forgotten that PT boats were a critical part of the Mediterranean theater of operations, because I think when many of us hear the word PT boat, I think our go-to is probably a lot of us think about JFK. We tend to think about PT-109, and we tend to think about a lot of the PT boat operations that were critical to the Pacific theater of war, but not a lot of press and not a lot of attention gets paid to a lot of the PT boat operations that happened not only in the Mediterranean, but were also a very critical part of the D-Day operation. So if you take a look at this picture right here, center mass, you will see the crew of PT-306 in the Mediterranean theater of operations. And if you look specifically, Marty Romano, he is one of the gentlemen who is kneeling in the front row. He is the second man from the right. And I will never forget one of the first times that I met Marty Romano, one of the very first meetings that I had with him. It was actually in the dead of winter, and I had the opportunity to go to his home at the time in Bloomington. And even though it was the dead of winter, and here was a gentleman who no joke, was 97 years old, and he was out in his front yard, and he was actually shoveling snow. And he was doing it with the dexterity of a 30-year-old. I mean, he was just doing these piles of snow like it was nobody's business. And I was thinking to myself, gosh, if I make it to 97, I want to be that strong, and I want to have that much energy. And when I spoke to him when I spoke to him for the first time, yeah, I was incredibly impressed not only by how energetic he was, but he had that raspy New Jersey accent. He looks at me and he says, "Oh, hey there, Mike, how's it going? Hey, you just go on inside and you grab yourself some coffee. I'll be right with you." So I go inside and the house is immaculate. He comes in, he shakes off, you know, he's shaking around like a 30-year-old. He sits down right in front of me, he takes a big swig of coffee and he's like, "Okay, Mike, what can I do this for?" And that started a very long series of interviews for the Combat Diaries that I had the opportunity to sit with him for. Now, if you take a look there's Marty Romano, and tragically, he recently passed away. As a matter of fact, he passed away. It was actually just this past February. He was 98, only a few months shy of his 99th birthday. But as you can see in that picture, it looks like he's about to make me an offer I can't refuse. So the story of Marty Romano begins, as it is, in the concrete jungle of Jersey City. He was born in June of 1924 in Jersey City, New Jersey, and he was the first generation American-born son of Italian immigrants. Now, he enjoys a childhood which is pretty typical of the children who were growing up in Jersey City at the time. He plays a lot of stickball in the street. He indulges himself in the local variety of athletics. He learns how to work on cars. But unfortunately, this was a point in American history where a lot of Italian immigrants, and particularly a lot of Italian Americans, were either discriminated against or they were looked upon with a lot of suspicion. And unfortunately, Marty Romano was no exception. But despite all that, he graduates from Dickinson High School in 1941, and his first job out of high school is as a machinist apprentice. He's working for a firearms manufacturer. He's learning how to tool all of the different components that go into these firearms, and he was especially proud of the fact that he learned how to operate all this machinery, and he said that he could bore the diameters of those barrels within 1/1000th of an inch. Well, because he is a machinist and because he has extensive experience working with firearms, that makes him a prime candidate for the draft. And not only that, that also makes him a prime candidate for the Navy. When he goes into the induction center, he finds out that the Navy is very hard up for machinists, and in particular, he becomes a machinist mate, the person who is responsible for operating the engine compartments throughout any of the variety of ships. So he's inducted into the U.S. Navy in September of 1943. And by this point, the war, at least for the American side of things, has been going on for the better part of 2 years now. And while he is in the middle of boot camp, he has no idea what exactly he's going to do after boot camp is over. He knows that he is going to be a machinist mate, but he has no idea what type of craft he'll be assigned to. But then by happenstance, when he's at the Naval Training Center, which is in Rhode Island at this point, he looks across the bay. He sees a few miles out on the horizon, he sees these small boats, and at first he doesn't really know what to make of them. He says, that's a small-looking craft out there. It doesn't look like anything I've seen before, and it's nothing that I've seen inside any of the training literature or any of the training films that we've had to this point. But what he finds out is that it's a PT boat, PT being an acronym for Patrol Torpedo. And the first thing that he says to himself when he sees this is, they're not big enough to be a destroyer, but they're a little bit too big to be a gunboat. I wonder what the heck those things are. I don't know what they're called. They don't look familiar, but by God, I'm impressed. And I want to find out as much of them as I can. That's when he learns that it's called a PT boat. And not only that, he's also impressed by what exactly their mission is. Here's a small boat that is actually made mostly of plywood. And not only that, it has to rely on speed, and it also has to rely on stealth. Because its mission, it operates mostly at night, and it's going to sneak up on these bigger enemy ships and fire off a few torpedoes and then get the heck out of Dodge before anybody knows what's happening. So they're too big to be gunboats, but he says, yeah, I'm impressed. So as a machinist mate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be responsible for everything that happens or doesn't happen as far as the engine compartment is concerned inside these PT boats. And he finds out through a matter of course that the engine suite inside the PT boat is actually a big Packard engine, and it's coincidental because as a youngster he used to work on detailing and taking apart the engines of the Packard cars, which were considered the premier luxury vehicles in America at that point. So he is inducted as a PT crewman. He is assigned to a PT squadron. He goes to the Mediterranean theater of operations, and by the time he gets there, it's the early spring of 1944. And he says, by this time, here's what the war looked like. He said, the North Africa campaign was done, and we had already conquered Sicily. We already had a toehold of operations on Sardinia, and the Salerno campaign was really in its mopping up phase at this point. But he says, my journey from getting from the point of embarkation to my PT squadron was an adventure in itself, because I landed at Casablanca, and I'll tell you from firsthand experience, he told me, he said that Casablanca was nothing like what happened in the Humphrey Bogart movie. He said that there was no Lauren Bacall. He said that there was no soiree at Rick's. He said it was just hot and it was stinky. He says that's the only thing I remember about it. And the first thing that they did, as if my reception at that place wasn't bad enough, what they did was they put me on a train, all right? They put me in, they actually put me inside of this big boxcar that was officially designed for horses. And they packed as many as upwards of 60 to 70 men inside there. And it was hot, it was cramped, we had absolutely no air conditioning, it was very poorly ventilated, and there were no bathrooms either. So he said what we had to do was we actually had to choose whether or not we were going to sweat inside, or whether or not we were going to sweat up on top of the boxcars because it was very hot. And I eventually decided that I was going to be sweating up on top of the boxcar, and I probably would have stayed up there, except there was one thing that I didn't count on. There was a swarm of locusts. He said right around the time we got through Algiers, there must have been thousands of these locusts that just came up out of nowhere. And I said, okay, well, do I really want to endure an Old Testament plague, or am I going to endure all of this human refuse that's down in the bottom? And I said, well, I think I'll take my chances down below. So finally he gets to Tunis, and that's when he is assigned to Motor Torpedo Squadron 15, otherwise known as RON 15. And he is assigned to PT 306. Now, I'm going to warn you guys ahead of time that it is naval convention that they give their ships nicknames, and back in 1944, there was no pretense of political correctness back then. And the nickname that they gave their ship is probably going to offend some, but yeah, just go ahead and take a look at the name. They called their ship the Fascinating Bitch. And if I can point out with this laser pointer, can everyone see that? That is Marty Romano, who is there at the helm of the ship. So that is PT 306, and that begins his nearly year-long tour in the Mediterranean. And here are some of the highlights from those operations. He said it was very interesting being a PT crewman in the Mediterranean at that time, because most of the naval threats that we had at that point in the Mediterranean were all gone, but there were still a lot of very interesting mission sets that we had at the time. He said, the first thing that we had to do when we were stationed up at Sardinia was we had a lot of search and destroy missions along the western coast of Italy. He said that really was our primary mission. We had to do these reconnaissance patrols, and if we saw something that belonged to the enemy, we had to open fire on it. And he said something that I'll never forget. He said, I have to admit that an eerie feeling came over me when I saw the Italian coast for the first time. This was the land of my forefathers. He said, this was the land that I had heard about from my mom and dad for years, but I had never had the opportunity to see it. I had always wanted to visit it at a tourist at some point in my life, but here I was, the very first time I was seeing this at all was as a sailor at war, and I was technically at war against the people of my ancestral homeland. He said that was something that he as an Italian American wrestled with, and as did a lot of other Italian Americans who were serving in the military at that time. And he said that one of the things that really stood out to him is that throughout all these nighttime patrols that we did, he said we were off the coast about, probably a good 15 to 20 miles off the coast. He said I could look and I could actually see the fighting even though it was at night. I could tell that it was fighting because I could see the muzzle flashes from the American tanks on one side, and I could see the responding muzzle flashes from the German tanks on the other side. He said I could see these muzzle flashes all throughout the night, but the thing that encouraged me was that throughout every nighttime patrol that we did, I would notice that these muzzle flashes would always be moving farther up the peninsula, and that was an indication to me at that point that we were winning the war, because we were gaining ground against the Germans, pushing them up against the Italian peninsula, and that's how I knew that we were gaining ground. He said, another thing that we did, in fact, most of what we did when we weren't running a lot of these nighttime patrols, we were a taxi service for the OSS, because all of these Allied spies, what they would do is they would come through the Allied headquarters in Sardinia, and they would get their mission briefs, they would get their missions, they would hop a ride on a PT boat, and then we would take them to their drop-off point, And that actually constituted a lot of our nighttime missions. We would drop off one spy at one point on the coast, and then we would go probably 10 to 15 miles up the coast, and then we would pick up another spy, and we would take him back to base. And it was this constant game of dropping off and picking up, and we would do that throughout all of these spy missions. But it was a very critical mission for us, because we knew that for every spy we picked up, that they were bringing back critical intelligence and also critical information, and that they were helping us win the campaign on the Italian peninsula. But it was fraught with peril. As a matter of fact, he recounted quite a few instances where he had some near brush with fratricide. Now, it was problematic being a PT boat crewman in the Mediterranean, because the Germans and the Italians both had PT boats of their own, and as luck would have it, the PT silhouettes very much resembled an American PT boat. The Germans called them E-boats, and the Italians called them Moss boats. Now, if you look at it from a distance with an untrained eye, or even worse, with a fatigued eye, it could very easily resemble an enemy watercraft. And that was the situation that Marty found himself on at least one occasion, where he had an Allied pilot mistake PT-306 for an enemy PT boat, open fire, and even though he was very lucky that nobody aboard his craft got hurt, he said that was a very scary experience for us. He said, even still to this day, I don't know how that pilot could have mistaken us for an enemy boat, because we had the American flag waving, and we had all of our signals to identify us as a friendly craft. But he said, even in the heat of war, even if you think you're safe, there is always that lingering threat of fratricide. Now, some more mission highlights that he told me about was supporting Operation Dragoon. Now, Operation Dragoon was the invasion of southern France, and it's another one of those things in American history that I don't think gets as much attention, and it also doesn't get as much press coverage as the invasion of northern France. Everybody seems to know about D-Day, but the invasion of southern France really doesn't get that much attention. But part of the support missions that he did in support of Operation Dragoon consisted of ferrying the British commandos to the beaches near Cannes along the French Riviera. And there was one mission in particular that he told me about where he was ferrying these British commandos. He said that we had to offload them at certain sites, and we essentially had to pray that they would find their targets. Well, this particular team of British commandos that they had dropped off unfortunately did not make their mission, because one of the commandos accidentally tripped a tripwire, and the entire team was captured by the Nazis. He said that these were always the things that you had to wrestle with, because you know you're doing an important mission. You know that you are delivering a set of commandos who are very highly trained, they're very highly specialized, and you really hope that the mission is going to go in their favor, but you always have to accept those odds that something's going to happen, and your mission in getting them to the beach is probably going to be for naught, at least at that particular moment. Another thing that he told me about, and one thing that I had absolutely never come across in any of my historical studies, was that he would have to fight off these kamikaze-style attacks from the other Italian PT boats. He said one of the things that he never really counted on was that a lot of the desperate Italian crews would resort to these kamikaze-style attacks where they would load up their PT boats with dynamite and they would try to ram the American PT boats. He said that this was a very scary thing that happened a lot more frequently than he had anticipated, but he recalled one mission where his own PT craft, PT-306, had to open fire on an incoming Italian boat that was laden with dynamite, and that the offending craft exploded only mere feet from his own. It was a very near brush with death. Now, towards the end of 1944, as the Battle of Bulge is going on, he actually redeploys from the Atlantic. He comes home for some R&R leave, and again, that is in December. He rotates out of the Mediterranean, but even though he's on R&R leave, it's pretty much an accepted fact at this point that if you redeploy from the Atlantic and you go home on R&R leave, you're going to be redeployed to the corresponding theater of war. So after he goes on R&R leave, he deploys to the Pacific, but this is where things really start to slow down for him, because he is assigned to Borneo, and he is dead sure that he is going to be signed as another machinist mate to another PT craft. but they said, well, we have a lot of influx of sailors coming in from the States, so what we need you to do is we need you to stay here inside of the replacement depot for a little while, and you need not to worry because we are going to find another ship for you. Well, they did find another ship, but it wasn't a PT boat. He was actually assigned to the USS Oyster Bay, which was not a PT boat, but a PT boat tender. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, a PT boat tender is a logistical ship that follows a PT squadron, and they're responsible for facilitating the fuel and the maintenance parts. It's basically just like a floating repair station for any number of the PT squadrons. But he said, here's where things get a little even more ironic. I was a machinist mate, but I essentially had no machine to operate because all of the PT boat tenders, they had a completely different engine suite than what the PT boats themselves had. So here I was rated and trained to handle a PT boat engine, but the USS Oyster Bay had their own contingent of engineers who were all doing a bang-up job to keep the engine steady. There was really no mission for me to do. So I was an engineer without an engine. I had absolutely nothing to work on, and they didn't even put me as a registered person on the ship's company. I was just extra weight. I was just an extra person on the manifest. I wasn't even part of the ship's company. He said, well, okay, I guess I'll just sit around and find some way to make myself useful. Maybe I can volunteer in the galley. Maybe I can swab a deck here or there. Or maybe if one engineer gets sick, I can, help move around some lug nuts. But turns out he didn't have to wait very long because only a few weeks after he got there, that was when both of the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Suddenly the war is over, and he is discharged on January 12th of 1946. Now his legacy lives on here as a very prominent engineer here in the Twin Cities, because after he was discharged from the Navy, he went back to his native New Jersey. He picked up pretty much right where he left off with his girlfriend. They got married. He went to school on the GI Bill, and he got a degree as a civil engineer. So after receiving his Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, he says, you know what I really want to do with my life? I want to build bridges, I want to build tunnels, and I want to try to provide any points of infrastructure anywhere I can. Well, one of his first jobs, fresh out of college, is working for an engineering firm called Edwards & Kelsey. Edwards & Kelsey had offices all across the U.S. He starts working in their New Jersey office, but then he gets a call from a team that has just set up an office here in Minneapolis and says, hey, we have a by-name request. There's a guy who's working for you. We know that he is a top-rated structural engineer. His name is Marty Romano, and we know a lot of the infrastructure points that he's done around New Jersey. We want to bring him out here because we're starting to build we're starting to build up this interstate system. We're starting to build a lot of things here in the Twin Cities, and we think we can use a guy like him. So he takes his wife and his 2 young daughters, and he goes to Minnesota, a place he's never been before. Doesn't know a thing about the culture, doesn't know a thing about the people. The winters are probably a lot more than he bargained for, but he gets here, and he very quickly adopts it as a second home. And as a member of Edwards & Kelsey, he becomes one of the managing directors, and he was the head engineer for a lot of projects that you and I, as residents of the Twin Cities, are familiar with, and even points of infrastructure that we've driven through on a regular basis. For instance, he was the chief engineer and designer of the Lowry Hill Tunnel. If you look right here, this big tunnel right here that's under 494, this tunnel right here, one that you and I have driven through many a times, he was the lead engineer. He was the structural designer for that. Aside from the Lowry Hill Tunnel on 94, he was also the principal designer and chief engineer for the 11th Street South Bridge, which you can see right there. And not only that, his seminal project, one that he worked shortly before his retirement, was the Richard I. Bong Memorial Bridge, which many of you are probably familiar with. This is what connects Duluth to Superior, Wisconsin. Here is the Duluth side, here is the Superior, Wisconsin side. This, for a long time, was the prominent bridge across all of the Great Lakes. So here you have a man of a very humble background who really fits the narrative of the greatest generation. He was a regular person just like you and me who rose to the occasion, and when the chips were down and the odds were stacked against him, he rose, he accomplished great things, and not only that, after he served his country, he continued that legacy of service, and even as a transplanted fellow from New Jersey, came here to the Twin Cities and left his mark in ways that will outlive him and outlive all of us, really. All of these key points of infrastructure here are a testament not only to his brilliance, not only to his stick-to-itiveness and his perseverance, but also a standing legacy to a regular man who rose to the occasion when his country called, even at a time when his own people were being discriminated against here at large throughout America. And that is the story of Marty Romano, who, as of a few weeks ago, has been dearly departed. Thank you.
At this time, we'd like to go to Q&A.
That ship that you were showing being built for 24 days, what type of ship was that?
That one happened to be a Liberty ship. They built 2,700 Liberty ships during the war and about 1,000 Victory ships, which had the same function. It was just an all-purpose transport vessel. Displaced about 10,000 tons, could carry general cargo, not personnel generally, but just to get stuff from place to place. There's one of them still afloat. The Brown is in Baltimore Harbor and open to visitors. So you can go on board and take a look at it. And even goes out to sea. You can, if you time it right, you can get a cruise around the bay on it.
So I have a question about your book, The Nimitz at War. Where did you get most of the information and background on him? And did you spend a lot of time in his hometown of Fredericksburg, Texas?
Yes to both. Most of the information, not by most, I mean more than half probably, came from the collections, special collections in the Nimitz Library, how appropriate is that, at the United States Naval Academy. I find it very interesting that the field house, when I was teaching there, was named for Bill Halsey. Appropriate, but the library was named for Chester Nimitz, and I think somehow that's pretty appropriate too. But they have in there a lot of letters that he wrote, and letters about him, and oral histories of people who knew him. And then a second, probably the second most important, was at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. There's a collection that's generally called the Gray Book. I don't know why it's called the Gray Book, because they're in blue bindings, but the Gray Book is 8 fat volumes, about 1,000 pages each of that tissue paper that they used for carbon copies in World War II. All the messages that went in and out of Nimitz's headquarters throughout the war, as well as a running summary that was kept by his chief of staff, Captain Steele, every day. And he would have a staff meeting every morning at 9 o'clock, and he'd say, all right, where are we? What are we talking about? What are we doing? And their minutes from those are in all of those volumes. So that's a great source. You ask about the Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, of which I was a director for 6 years. It's a great museum. If you haven't been, I highly recommend it. It's in the hill country of Texas. You wouldn't expect the National Museum of the Pacific War to be in the hill country of Texas. But it was established there because that's where he was born and where he was raised in nearby Kerrville. And so they have a lot of material as well. Those are probably the 3 best places for material on Chester Nimitz. Thank you for the question.
The British Navy operated in Norway and off Dunkirk and Greece. Did that affect the U.S. Navy's thinking of how they would be able to operate by the Japanese?
Yeah, there are a couple of ways in which the experience of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean influenced, I think, thinking about the war, not only for the Americans and how we would respond, but for the Japanese as well. You know, the British launched a daring airplane torpedo attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto early in 1940, and interested observers were included representatives from the Imperial Japanese Navy who said, oh, look at this, airplanes from carriers can sink battleships at anchor. What a good idea. That may not be the sole inspiration for their subsequent attack, but I think it did contribute to it. And you mentioned the Royal Navy in Greece, and what was the other one? Where else? Norway. You know, the Norway operation is understudied. I notice we talk about the German conquest of the lowlands and the fall of France and so on, the conquest of Poland. Norway, the Norway expedition was entirely conducted by sea, subsequently supported by air, but in a curious sort of way, the Germans loaded all their soldiers onto destroyers and just ran them into harbors, and they climbed out over the side and took over the country. I mean, it was an astonishingly bold maneuver and should not have worked, and somehow did. So I think paying attention to the Norwegian campaign, the Greek campaign, and as I already mentioned, the Toronto campaign, lots of lessons to be learned by both sides from the Royal Navy experience. And of course, it's useful to remember the Royal Navy had been at this for 2 years before we're even in the war. And their whole attitude was, look, we know what we're doing. You Yanks are late to the party here, and we like your money, and we like your ships and your tools of war, and your manpower is going to be useful if you leave our women alone. But we know what we're doing here. Stop trying to affect our strategic thinking. So there was a bit of pulling and tugging throughout the entire war in that respect.
The picture that you showed of MacArthur and Nimitz got me thinking. I'm curious about how well did they collaborate and coordinate their strategies in the Pacific? Was there any clash of egos?
Nimitz, one of Nimitz's several great skills was his ability to read the room and judge the circumstances and deal with people where they were effectively. He knew MacArthur was a difficult guy to work with and went out of his way to be agreeable. He had the same relationship, by the way, with Ernie King, another tough guy to get along with. King and Nimitz met 16 times during the war, and King would start telling him what to do, and Nimitz would, yes, sir, a fine idea. Have you considered this possibility? We all have dealt with people in our professional and personal lives where you just have to calibrate how you're going to deal with those folks. And MacArthur would simply not leave his headquarters for his part. He would be ordered, you know, why don't we meet in Guam? Why don't we meet in Hawaii? No, I'm busy. I don't have the time. I can't. The one time he did go to Hawaii in October of 1944, he was invited by the President of the United States to have a conference with Nimitz and FDR in Hawaii. And he said, I can't come, I'm too busy. So Roosevelt's Chief of Staff, Leahy, rewrote the invitation as an order. And so MacArthur showed up, but he was not happy about it. There's a famous photograph, I probably should have showed it here, of the three of them. Roosevelt sitting in the middle, MacArthur on one side, Nimitz on the other. Nimitz is in his summer whites. MacArthur's in a leather bomber jacket. Now this is July in Hawaii, but there he is in the bomber jacket. And I just think Nimitz is the guy who tried harder to make sure it didn't ever come to an open confrontation. MacArthur didn't have to try, he was MacArthur.
Craig, what a wonderful presentation, and I don't want to overshadow that, but I want the audience to recognize these two young historians who did such a wonderful job. When I was planning this program, Mike mentioned that he interviewed him. We'd actually planned to have Marty as one of our speakers this evening, and I attended his funeral.
I think Marty would have appreciated the interpretation of his diction as well.
I'm sure he would. Yeah.
Use guys.
Well done. Thank you. Okay.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.